children would be waiting outside, and the parent would come out and drive up, and the child would come up to the car, and the mother, you know, well, here's what I did today, and the mother would be like this,
Looking at her phone.
looking at her phone, and the child would like get into the car, and the mother would like look up for a second to make sure, like, to do a positive ID that the right kid had gotten to the car, and then drive off, like, just by looking at the car, not looking at the child. It was, and I would watch the child get more and more agitated, trying to get, and then that experience of watching children get crazy agitated as they got into the car with these parents made me start to want to do observations of children and parents in restaurants, children and parents, and just at parks. Parks was really where I did most of my watching. Not just parents, but any kind of minder or sitter or nanny. Children trying to get the attention of their caretaker. And they went through all of the stages of that Tronic had described, where, you know, first they try to be charming, then they try to be agitated, then they try to be crying, then they literally become vegetative and give up. And give up. Because they cannot get their parents away from the phone.
And I think in the research, if this happens below a certain frequency, there isn't been, which is actually a useful kind of stress. And what Ed says about these face-to-face interactions is that every 3 to 5 seconds, there's an error, a mismatching state, and then a repair. And that the hard learning that we always do is about how to make that reparation when we've missed something happening between us. It's when this goes on too many times for too long that the child learns how to become really organized around not connecting
Exactly.
and shutting down.
And I think that is really what I began to see, and why I began to be less surprised when teachers talked about my kids are on the spectrum, my kids are on the spectrum, my kids are starting to be on the spectrum. I'm worrying about. In the past 5 years, I've seen more and more kids who seem to me to be on the spectrum. This school is not supposed to be for kids on the spectrum. And I felt that they were organizing their lives. The children were organizing how to be in families where there essentially was not that kind of connection.
So speaking of connection, I have to ask you about breastfeeding.
Yeah.
Barry Brazelton did this research a long time ago where he looked at mother-infant interactions during breastfeeding. And what he found was, talking about connections, that infants have this rhythmic sucking pattern, which is predictable. Suck, suck, pause. And what do they do when they pause? They look up at their mothers.
Right.
And mothers think, you know, they can tell the baby to get back to business, but the more the mothers talk with the baby about, you know, sucking again, the longer the pause is, because the baby wants the interaction more even than the breast. So, you know, now we know that there are many mothers who are breastfeeding with one arm and on their phone with the other, and they may not even know what it would be like if
they talked to the baby.
Or if the phone weren't in their lives.
I remember the first time I saw a mother breastfeeding and watching their phone. And I was so upset. I mean, because we forget, now that these things are like a part of our everyday lives, and this is, I think, very important, they've become naturalized. And when something is natural, you don't see it anymore. We forget how odd it was to see a woman not pay any attention to her baby when she was breastfeeding. Because now or go to a McDonald's and watch a family eating their food with everybody looking at their phone and nobody talking.
So what do you say when a mother
So
says...
when I first saw this, I watched this horrified. I knew how bad this was. I knew this was like, the infant was looking at her. She was not looking at the infant looking with her because she was in the middle of them. She was like going like this to the thing. And didn't know what to do with myself. Because I hadn't written the book yet, I couldn't like say, excuse me, I just want to send you. Can I just put you on my list?
Would that work?
But it was clearly it was so upsetting to me. And now we are so used to it. And what else are we used to? We're used to mothers not paying attention to their children in playgrounds. We're used to mothers not paying attention to their children when they're in playpens. And the playpens are a place where I really carefully studied, because I knew that people were going to say to me, oh, mothers have always put children in playpens and just read a book or watched television. And so I compared, here's where I really did go in and do the sort of much more sort of finely grained observational counting and taking with a stop clock work. When a mother watches television, she looks up very frequently to check on the kid in the playpen. When a mother is on any kind of device, hardly ever. Similarly, for male parents and their male children, when they're watching a game and they're on television and they have like a newspaper between them, they talk very frequently. If the father is on a device, he barely speaks to his child. So all of the people who say, oh, it's just like, it isn't true.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that, and that gets to that people are studying what is it that makes these devices so compelling, so addictive, so powerful in holding on to our attention. But I also have to ask you about when you talk about parents for whom this has become the norm, and we talked earlier about what skills children are not developing. Well, what skills are parents losing that is behind their looking at their phone and not their child when they pick them up or when they're sitting right next to them?
Well, the skills that parents and children are losing are oddly parallel. So parents and children are losing the same skill. They're losing the capacity for boredom, and they're losing the capacity for solitude, and they're losing the capacity for empathic empathy and the kind of empathy that you use in conversation. But let's start with solitude and boredom, because many people kind of confuse them or think they're the same thing. So for the child, the capacity to be bored turns out to be a key developmental building block. Because when you experience boredom, your brain isn't bored. It's laying down neurally what's called the default mode network, which is really where your brain develops the kind of sense of a stable autobiographical self. So you need those moments of, oh, nothing to do, I think I'll just sit and review.
The things that I usually worry about, for example.
Review my anxieties. Oh, well, I'm bored of those now. I'll review. You think you're thinking about nothing. I'm waiting for my taxi, but I don't have my phone to take out, so I'm just waiting. Your brain is actually very busy while you think you're just letting thoughts go by. And without that time, your brain doesn't do as well. So you need to learn how to give yourself what in meditation we call time to let thoughts come and go, time to just sort of let it be. So when you give a baby a potty trainer or a baby bouncer with a slot for an iPhone, so in any moment of potential boredom, it has stimulation, you are doing that baby no favor. And as a parent, if you can tolerate being with your baby or being with your child without each of you being stimulated, you're doing neither of you any favor. Because grown-ups need this time as well. The second bad thing that's happening is the capacity for solitude, which is a little bit different It can look the same as the need for boredom, but it can look the same, but it's developmentally and psychologically serves a different function. In solitude, you need solitude in order to develop relationships, because you need to be able to be happy with your own company in order to then, when you're with somebody else, be able to pay attention to them. Because if I can't stand my company, then as soon as you come along, I'm looking for you to validate me. Tell me I'm great, tell me how fascinating I am, tell me who I am. And I don't have any time or patience to pay attention to, well, who are you? So that we can establish a relationship that's really based on mutuality, which is really the only good kind.
This, for me, was one of the most brilliant insights in
Yes.
the book, and everybody I shared it with is just so fascinated with this idea. And the way I understood it is, it's not only about having pleasure with yourself and being happy with
Right.
yourself, it's simply the experience of being with yourself, experiencing yourself alone in solitude, having whatever thoughts and feelings you might
Right.
have as a way of experiencing yourself, knowing yourself, because you can't be in conversation with someone else if you don't have yourself to bring to that conversation,
Exactly.
right?
Let's say I don't
Yeah.
like me. People say,
Yeah.
well, but you know, what about if you don't like yourself? I say, well, that's just as good.
Bring that person, and bring that person to
Take
show
that-
up. Yeah.
Take that
Yeah.
person.
Yeah.
You know, everybody isn't
Yeah.
madly in love with, take that vaguely unhappy person out to dinner, and say to you, I've been doing a lot of, that's not terrible. If we went out to dinner, and we were over drinks, I said, I've just been doing a lot of thinking, I've been doing kind of life, I'm writing a memoir, and I really am very unhappy with some of the decisions I've made. And you would say, well, that's really interesting, what are the decisions you've made that
It's
you're not
it's a
happy
gift,
with?
really.
And then I'd say, well, here are a couple.
Yeah.
And then you might say, well, looking back, that's a friendship.
Yeah.
So it's not about that you have to look back, you can only do this if you're, like Mother Teresa or something. You can, what it does require is a willingness for vulnerability. So solitude, a willingness for vulnerability, a willingness for empathy, these tend to go together. And you are not letting this happen if at the moment that you start to feel, a moment of solitude, a moment when I might have to look at something complicated, where's my phone?
Let me check the weather.
Let me check the weather, and maybe let me check the weather in Singapore, and I hear that, who's that, architect in Barcelona, Gaudi, and maybe look at some of his stuff. It's over. You've lost the moment.
Yeah, and those moments are always changing too. I mean, you have to keep on coming back to moments of solitude to find out where you are and who you are in that
Yes.
moment, and that's who you would bring to the conversation you have
Yes.
today, right? You also talk about loneliness, and one strand of the vulnerability is when you're with yourself and not looking at the weather, you may experience loneliness,
Yes,
right?
and you need to also teach your children, you're talking about parenting, you need to teach your children that the experience of loneliness, first of all, the experience of solitude is not always the experience of loneliness. We need to start to divide those off, that loneliness and solitude are not the same thing. And that actually, when people are having experiences of solitude and are creating things and are writing things, I'm writing a book now and spending a tremendous amount of time alone. And it doesn't feel like loneliness at all. It feels like very constructive solitude. And people say, really? You just spent like 10 hours? And I said, wasn't it awful? And really? No. And I don't think it makes, I've never thought of myself as a hermit, or as I think of myself as a very social person.
Kind of show.
It was not, it was good. It was
Yeah.
good. It was good solitude. I feel very creative. But the experience of loneliness is very available to me. I have the experience of loneliness. But when I do, you know what? that's an experience too. And the only thing, there are many things to do about it. And the most healthy one is not necessarily going on Facebook. And that's not necessarily like that's not necessarily the best treatment for that particular problem. Because what you get may not be the friendship and the conversation and the sustaining relationship that you need.
So let's talk a little bit about friction. Because part
This is
of
my new thing.
part of keeping your attention is getting rid of anything that disrupts it, like friction. So the goal of the tech companies is to remove friction. One click and you
Right.
bought something because they got your
Right.
credit card, right? So, but what you're talking about, for example, with something like loneliness or other feelings that are hard to have, but that we have to have, and we all have them, is there's some sticking, there's some friction. And when you go to Facebook and you get a thumbs up, you get a like, it's not engaged with the loneliness that you might have been feeling that drove you there.
Yeah,
So
it's
this is
kind of
a
like
new
a
thing.
generic, it's like a kind of a generic blanket of warmth. Doesn't speak to anything specific really about you.
Yeah.
And we get used to this kind of like, it's like when you take morphine, it doesn't take away the pain, it makes you not notice the pain. And that model, that narcotic model for how to deal with pain is actually a very prevalent model in our culture. You don't take away the specific problem, you just make it no longer relevant
Yeah.
to you. And I think that happens politically, you don't fix the thing, you just somehow do something to people's heads where they're not thinking about it anymore and no longer seems to be their problem or relevant to them.
When I heard you talk about friction, it made me think again about the face-to-face research.
Right.
This notion of an error and repair every 3 to 5 seconds.
Yeah.
And that there's struggle there in the repair,
Yes.
you get stuck there. But the learning happens because there is an error, because you come apart, because you've got to find where you were, where the other person was to get
Right.
into conversation again.
That's so interesting.
Yeah, so I thought that was part of what you're
Yes.
describing.
My favorite example is, it's such a funny example. I remember a demo. It's become my favorite example because it's so funny. I remember a demo of the Internet of Things at MIT. One of the first demos I went to. And this demo was of ordering coffee. And you ordered your coffee, your cappuccino, macchiato, something very complicated. And the whole world was wired up to your computer, so you would be routed to the coffee shop, which of course your cappuccino, macchiato, latte, white,
It's waiting for you.
is waiting for you. But it would route you in a way where you wouldn't pass anybody you didn't like, ex-boyfriend, ex-wife, ex-husband, department chairman with whom you might have had a fight, because the whole world, it knew everybody in your relationships with everybody. And so you could get a route to your coffee shop where you only passed people you liked in this friction-free world of where the Internet of Things could take us. And I thought that was perfect. That the Internet of Things would not, that the computer culture would not only create a friction-free world of like trading on the stock market, but it would create a friction-free world of social relationships where you would know not what to talk to me about, what not to mention. It would just kind of glide through. And that is such a not right, that is such a not good way to live. I mean, who said that that's a good way to live? And similarly, in this wonderful image from the chronic Brazelton research, that it's only through mistake repair, that kind of we're constructing really the most powerful skill set. I love that.
And this is also where what's happening in our public world comes into, because part of reducing friction means that we are just in our bubbles talking with people who we agree with.
Right.
And are protected from talking with people who we don't agree with. And so we're stuck in this polarized world.
And we don't know how to talk to them anymore.
Yeah.
I mean, and you watch people talking, who are clearly talking to people in their bubbles,
Mhm.
and you say to yourself, I can't believe that this is working.